The laughter started the moment Margaret Chen stepped onto the firing line at the Rocky Mountain Precision Shooting Championship. At 62, with her silver hair pulled back in a practical bun and reading glasses perched on her nose, she looked more like someone's grandmother than a competitor in one of the nation's most prestigious marksmanship competitions. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Did someone's mom get lost looking for the bingo hall? Whispered Jake Morrison, a 28-year-old former Marine sniper whose tactical vest was covered in patches from various shooting competitions. His comment sparked a ripple of chuckles from the younger competitors clustered around the registration table. Margaret quietly filled out her paperwork, her weathered hands steady despite the obvious scrutiny from the 40 other participants. She wore simple khaki pants, a plain navy blue polo shirt, and comfortable walking shoes, a stark contrast to the military-style gear and expensive shooting apparel that seemed to be the unofficial uniform of serious competitors. "Ma'am, are you sure you're in the right place?" asked Brad Kelly, the competition organizer, his voice carrying the kind of patronizing tone reserved for confused elderly people. "This is a precision rifle competition. The maximum range is 1,200 yards, and we'll be shooting in challenging conditions." Margaret looked up from her registration form, her dark eyes calm and unwavering. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she replied simply, her voice carrying a quiet authority that momentarily silenced the surrounding chatter. The Rocky Mountain Precision Shooting Championship was held annually in the rugged terrain outside Colorado Springs, attracting elite marksmen from across the country. Military snipers, law enforcement sharpshooters, and civilian precision rifle enthusiasts gathered to test their skills against targets at extreme distances, often in harsh weather conditions that would challenge even the most experienced shooters. This year's field was particularly strong. Jake Morrison had just finished his second tour in Afghanistan, where he'd logged over 200 confirmed kills as a Marine Scout sniper. Tommy Rodriguez, a 32-year-old former Army Ranger, held the current record for the longest confirmed kill by a U.S. soldier. Lisa Chung, one of only 3 women in the competition, was a federal agent who'd won the FBI's National Marksmanship Championship 3 years running. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, like this video, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And then there was Margaret Chen, whose only visible credential was an expired military ID card from 1985 that she'd shown at registration. 1985? Jake had said, examining the card with exaggerated amazement. "That's older than I am. What did you do, drive a Jeep?" The assumption wasn't unreasonable. Military women in 1985 had been largely excluded from combat roles, relegated to support positions that kept them away from the front lines. The idea that this quiet woman in her 60s could have acquired the kind of precision shooting skills needed to compete at this level seemed laughable to most observers. Margaret had said nothing in response to Jake's comment, simply tucked her ID back into her wallet and moved to the equipment inspection area. She pulled a worn rifle case from the back of her modest Honda Civic, another source of amusement for competitors who'd arrived with custom-built trucks and trailers full of gear. "Let's see what Grandma brought to the party," Tommy Rodriguez said, loud enough for others to hear as Margaret opened her case. The rifle that emerged was a study in understated quality. While others had brought the latest tactical rifles with every possible accessory, Margaret's weapon was a classic Remington 700 in .308 caliber, clearly decades old but meticulously maintained. The stock showed the wear of countless hours of practice, and the scope, while high quality, was a simple variable power model without the digital displays and ballistic computers that adorned most of the other rifles. "Is that thing even legal?" asked Derek Stevens, a 35-year-old police sniper whose rifle looked like it had been assembled from a military contractor's catalog. "Pretty sure that scope predates the Cold War." Margaret ran her hands along the rifle's familiar contours, checking the bolt action and examining the barrel crown with the practiced eye of someone who understood precision equipment. She'd built this rifle herself in 1987, hand-selecting each component and spending months perfecting the trigger, bedding the action, and developing the perfect load for the ammunition she'd brought. "Everything's within competition specifications," she said quietly, handing her paperwork to the range safety officer who was conducting equipment inspections. The RSO, a retired Army sergeant named Mike Patterson, examined Margaret's rifle with professional thoroughness. Unlike the younger competitors, Mike had been around long enough to recognize quality when he saw it, regardless of age or appearance. "Nice stick," he said approvingly, testing the rifle's safety mechanism. "Custom work?" "Some," Margaret replied, accepting the rifle back after it passed inspection. The morning briefing took place in a large tent that had been erected near the firing line. Brad Kelly outlined the competition format: 3 stages of increasing difficulty, with targets ranging from 400 to 1,200 yards. Weather conditions were challenging: gusty winds with speeds varying from 8 to 15 miles per hour, partly cloudy skies that would create rapidly changing light conditions, and temperatures in the mid-40s that would test both equipment and shooter endurance. "This isn't a game," Kelly emphasized, his eyes scanning the assembled competitors. "Precision shooting at these distances requires absolute focus, perfect technique, and the ability to read environmental conditions that change by the minute. If you're not prepared for the challenge, there's no shame in stepping aside." His gaze lingered on Margaret for a moment longer than necessary, the implication clear. Margaret sat in the back of the tent, away from the clusters of competitors, who were already forming alliances and sharing information about their equipment and training backgrounds. She listened to the briefing with the same quiet attention she'd given to countless mission briefings decades earlier, noting the range layout, wind patterns, and scoring system. "The first stage is our warm-up," Kelly continued. 5 shots. At 400 yards, standard bullseye targets. Should be manageable for anyone with basic precision rifle skills. Snickers could be heard from various parts of the tent. For these elite marksmen, 400 yards was indeed a warm-up distance, well within the capabilities of anyone who'd made it this far in their shooting careers. Stage 2 gets more interesting. 7 shots at 600 yards, but we're using military-style silhouette targets with a smaller scoring zone. Wind will be a factor, and the light conditions might change during the string. Margaret made mental notes about the sun angle and cloud patterns she'd observed during the drive to the range. After 37 years of precision shooting, she'd learned to read weather conditions like a second language, understanding how subtle changes in humidity, temperature, and air pressure could affect bullet flight. "Stage 3 is where we separate the professionals from the hobbyists," Kelly said with evident satisfaction. 5 shots at 1,200 yards, using reactive targets that will show immediate hit or miss results. Time limit of 45 minutes for all 5 shots, including target acquisition and environmental assessment. The tent had grown quiet as competitors absorbed the challenge. Even for experienced snipers, 1,200-yard shots required exceptional skill and perfect conditions. The addition of a time limit would add pressure that could cause even skilled shooters to rush their shots and make critical errors. "Questions?" Kelly asked, scanning the room. Jake Morrison raised his hand. "What's the prize structure?" "First place receives $5,000 cash, a custom rifle package worth $8,000, and automatic qualification for the National Precision Rifle Championship. Second and third place receive cash prizes and rifle accessories." Margaret had no interest in the prizes. She'd driven 12 hours from her home in Phoenix for reasons that had nothing to do with money or recognition. This competition represented something far more personal, a chance to honor a promise made decades ago and to prove something to herself that had nothing to do with the opinions of the young men around her. As the briefing concluded, competitors began moving toward the firing line to claim their positions and set up their equipment. Margaret gathered her gear bag and rifle case, moving at her own pace while others hurried to secure the best spots. "Hey, Mrs. Chen," called out Tommy Rodriguez, his voice carrying mock concern. "Are you sure about this? These guys are pretty serious, and the conditions are rough today. Nobody would think less of you if you wanted to just watch." Margaret paused, her rifle case in one hand and her range bag in the other. For a moment, she considered the younger man's suggestion. It would be easy to step aside, to avoid the potential embarrassment of failing in front of this crowd of elite shooters. At 62, she had nothing to prove to anyone, and the comfortable routine of her retirement life was waiting back in Phoenix. But then she thought about the small wooden box in her bedroom closet, filled with commendations and photos from a part of her life that most people would never know about. She thought about the promises she'd made to herself and to others, promises that had shaped 37 years of quiet practice and preparation. "I appreciate the concern," she replied, her voice carrying a warmth that surprised those listening. "But I didn't drive 12 hours to watch." She continued toward the firing line, leaving Tommy and the others to exchange glances that mixed amusement with growing curiosity. There was something about the woman's quiet confidence that didn't match their expectations of a confused retiree who'd stumbled into the wrong competition. The firing line at the Rocky Mountain Precision Shooting Championship was a testament to the precision rifle community's commitment to excellence. Each shooting position was carefully prepared, with concrete shooting benches, wind flags at regular intervals, and spotting scopes positioned to help shooters observe their impacts. The backdrop was the Colorado Rockies, their snow-capped peaks providing a dramatic setting for what promised to be an equally dramatic competition. Margaret claimed position 23, near the center of the line. Her neighbors were Jake Morrison on the left and Lisa Chong on the right, both accomplished shooters who'd been eyeing her equipment with barely concealed skepticism. "That's a nice-looking rifle," Lisa said, her tone more diplomatic than some of the men's comments. "How long have you been shooting precision rifle?" Margaret began unpacking her equipment with methodical precision. "A while," she replied, avoiding specifics. Lisa persisted, genuinely curious about the older woman's background. "What got you into long-range shooting? It's not exactly a common hobby for most people." "I had good teachers," Margaret said simply. Pulling out a small notebook filled with handwritten data tables and environmental calculations, Jake Morrison, overhearing the conversation, leaned over from his position. "Teachers? Like a husband or boyfriend who was into shooting?" The assumption was typical, that Margaret's involvement in precision shooting must have been derivative, inspired by a man in her life rather than her own interest and ability. It was the kind of casual sexism that had followed her throughout her career, made worse by the generational gap that led these young shooters to assume she'd lived a traditional domestic life. Margaret's response was interrupted by the range safety officer's call for the competition to begin. "Shooters, prepare for stage 1. You'll have 20 minutes to complete 5 shots at 400 yards. When you're ready, the line is hot." As competitors began setting up their rifles and adjusting their optics, Margaret went through her own preparation routine. She checked her scope settings, confirmed her rifle's zero, and made wind calculations based on the flags she could see downrange. Her movements were economical and precise, developed through decades of practice in conditions far more challenging than this Colorado morning. The first shots began ringing out across the range as competitors settled into their rhythm. Margaret took her time, breathing steadily as she aligned her crosshairs with the target 400 yards away. The wind was gusty but manageable, and the light conditions were stable enough for accurate shooting. Her first shot broke cleanly, the rifle recoiling straight back as she maintained her sight picture. Through her scope, she could see the bullet's impact in the target's center ring. Around her, other shooters were achieving similar results. At 400 yards, most of these elite marksmen could shoot nearly perfect scores. "Not bad for a beginner," Jake commented, having observed Margaret's first shot through his spotting scope. Margaret said nothing, cycling her bolt and preparing for her second shot. She was focused entirely on the process now, her mind clear of distractions as she settled into the familiar rhythm of precision shooting. The external noise, the comments, the laughter, the assumptions about her capabilities, faded into background static. Her second shot joined the first in the target center, followed by 3 more that formed a tight group well within the scoring zone. When the string was complete, Margaret had achieved a near-perfect score, missing the maximum by only a few points. "Decent shooting," Tommy Rodriguez observed, checking his own target through binoculars. "But wait until the distance opens up." The implication was clear, that Margaret's success at 400 yards was a fluke, beginner's luck that would evaporate when the real challenge began. The assumption seemed reasonable to most observers. Long-range precision shooting was exponentially more difficult as distance increased, and the 600-yard stage would require skills that took years to develop, but Margaret had been developing those skills for 37 years, through conditions and challenges that made this Colorado morning seem like a pleasant day at the range. As she prepared for the second stage, she allowed herself a small smile. The real test was about to begin, and she was ready. The wind had picked up slightly as competitors moved to the 600-yard line, and the cloud cover was becoming more variable, creating the kind of rapidly changing light conditions that could turn a perfect shot into a disappointing miss. Margaret watched the wind flags carefully, noting the patterns and variations that would affect her bullet's flight path. "This is where it gets interesting," Jake Morrison announced to anyone within earshot. 600 yards with variable wind. And changing light. Time to see who's been practicing and who's just along for the ride. He glanced meaningfully at Margaret, who was quietly adjusting her scope's elevation turret for the longer distance. Her movements were precise and confident, suggesting a familiarity with the equipment that went beyond casual hobby shooting. "Are you sure about your adjustments?" Lisa Chong asked, noting Margaret's scope settings. "The wind's really picking up, and that light change is going to affect your point of impact." Margaret nodded her appreciation for the advice. "I've factored it in," she said, her voice carrying the same quiet confidence she displayed throughout the morning. The second stage was about to begin, and Margaret Chen was ready to show these young shooters something they'd never expected to see from a 62-year-old woman with a vintage rifle and a lifetime of secrets. As competitors prepared for the 600-yard stage, Margaret Chen pulled out her small weathered notebook and began making calculations that caught the attention of nearby shooters. The pages were filled with decades of handwritten data, ballistic coefficients, atmospheric pressure readings, temperature effects on velocity, and wind deflection charts that showed the kind of meticulous record-keeping associated with serious, long-range shooting. "What's all that?" asked Derek Stevens, the police sniper, peering over at Margaret's notes with obvious skepticism. "Looks like someone's been doing their homework." Margaret glanced up from her calculations, noting the wind speed indicator that showed gusts varying between 12 and 18 miles per hour with irregular patterns. "Environmental data," she replied simply, returning to her notebook. "Wind's got some interesting characteristics today." Jake Morrison, who'd been struggling with his own wind calculations, scoffed at the comment. "Interesting? It's just gusty crosswind. Nothing a decent shooter can't handle with proper dope." The term dope referred to the data on previous engagements that snipers used to make accurate shots under various conditions. Jake's casual use of military terminology was clearly intended to establish his credentials while highlighting Margaret's apparent amateur status. Margaret made a final notation in her book and closed it, her expression unchanged by Jake's dismissive tone. She'd encountered similar attitudes throughout her career, young operators who mistook experience for weakness and assumed that technical knowledge could be replaced by bravado. "Shooters, prepare for Stage 2, announced Mike Patterson, the range safety officer. 7 shots at 600 yards, military silhouette targets. Scoring zone is reduced to simulate center mass hits. Time limit is 30 minutes. When ready, the line is hot." The 600-yard targets were indeed more challenging than the previous stage. The scoring zone was roughly the size of a dinner plate, and the silhouette design meant that any shot outside the vital area would receive 0 points. Combined with the increasing wind and variable light conditions, this stage would begin to separate the truly skilled marksmen from those who'd simply gotten lucky at shorter range. Margaret settled into her shooting position with the same methodical precision she displayed throughout the morning. She adjusted her scope for the longer distance, made final wind calculations based on her observations of the flag's downrange, and settled into a comfortable prone position behind her vintage Remington. Around her, other competitors were making their own preparations. Jake Morrison was using a sophisticated ballistic computer that factored in temperature, humidity, and barometric pressure to calculate precise firing solutions. Tommy Rodriguez had deployed a portable weather station that provided real-time atmospheric data. Lisa Chong was consulting a laminated data card that contained drop charts for various distances and conditions. Margaret's approach appeared almost primitive by comparison. She relied on her notebook, her observations of environmental conditions, and decades of experience that had taught her to read the subtle signs that electronic equipment often missed. Her first shot at 600 yards broke cleanly, and through her scope she could see the bullet impact well within the scoring zone. The hit drew a surprised grunt from Jake Morrison, who'd been watching through his spotting scope. "Lucky wind call," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. Margaret's second shot followed the first into the target's vital zone, And her third shot created a tight group that demonstrated consistent accuracy under the challenging conditions. By her fourth shot, even the most skeptical observers were beginning to take notice. "She's actually hitting," Tommy Rodriguez said, his voice carrying surprise that bordered on disbelief. "I mean, really hitting. That's not beginner's luck." Derek Stevens, who'd been struggling with his own wind calls, watched Margaret's fifth shot through binoculars. "That's a textbook wind hold," he admitted grudgingly. "She's reading the conditions better than half the guys here." Margaret's technique was indeed textbook, but it was textbook from a different era and a different context than what these civilian competitors had learned. Her shooting position was rock solid, developed through years of practice in positions where movement could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Her breathing was controlled and rhythmic, a pattern that had been drilled into her through countless hours of training. Most importantly, her wind reading skills were the product of real-world experience in conditions far more challenging than a Colorado shooting range. Her sixth shot struck the target's center, and her seventh completed a group that would have been impressive even on a calm day with perfect light. Margaret had achieved a nearly perfect score at 600 yards while other competitors were struggling with the variable conditions. "How the hell did she do that?" Jake Morrison demanded, his own target showing several misses that had cost him valuable points. "That wind was shifting every 30 seconds. Mike Patterson, the range safety officer, had been observing the competition from a position that allowed him to watch all the shooters. Unlike the younger competitors, Mike had enough experience to recognize exceptional shooting when he saw it, regardless of the shooter's appearance or background. "Ma'am," he said, approaching Margaret's position as she was packing up her equipment for the move to the 1,200-yard line. "That was some fine shooting. Mind if I ask where you learned to read wind like that?" Margaret looked up from her rifle case, considering her response carefully. "I had good instructors," she said finally. "They taught me that equipment is only as good as the person using it." The comment was diplomatically neutral, but Mike caught the undertone of experience that went far beyond casual hobby shooting. He'd seen enough military snipers to recognize the signs, the methodical preparation, the economy of movement, the ability to perform under pressure that suggested extensive training under challenging conditions. "Military?" he asked quietly, his voice low enough that nearby competitors couldn't overhear. Margaret's eyes met his for a moment, and Mike saw something there that confirmed his suspicions. "A long time ago," she replied simply, before Mike could ask follow-up questions. Brad Kelly's voice carried across the range. "Shooters, we're moving to the 1,200-yard line for the final stage. Transport your equipment and prepare for the ultimate test of precision shooting skills." The move to the final firing position created a natural break in the competition, allowing competitors to reassess their standings and prepare for the most challenging stage. Margaret's performance at 600 yards had elevated her to third place overall, a position that none of the other shooters had anticipated. "She's got to be shooting hot loads," Tommy Rodriguez suggested to a group of competitors who were discussing Margaret's unexpected success. "No way that old rifle shoots that accurately with factory ammunition." The implication was that Margaret was somehow cheating, using overpowered ammunition that violated competition rules. It was a common accusation when shooters couldn't explain another competitor's superior performance. Lisa Chong, who'd finished the 600-yard stage in sixth place, shook her head at Tommy's suggestion. "I watched her shooting. Everything looked legal to me. She's just reading the wind better than most of us." "Come on," Jake Morrison interjected. "She's 60-something years old with a rifle that's older than my car. There's got to be an explanation." The explanation was walking quietly toward the 1,200-yard firing line, carrying her vintage rifle and worn equipment bag while mentally preparing for the most challenging shots of the day. Margaret had been shooting at 1,200 yards and beyond for longer than most of these competitors had been alive, under conditions that made this Colorado morning seem like ideal shooting weather. The 1,200-yard targets were barely visible to the naked eye, small reactive targets that would provide immediate feedback when hit. The distance was extreme even by precision shooting standards, requiring not only exceptional marksmanship skills but also the ability to read environmental conditions across a much larger area where wind speed and direction could vary significantly. Margaret set up her shooting position with the same methodical precision she displayed throughout the competition. She checked her scope's adjustment range, confirmed her ballistic calculations for the extreme distance, and began the process of reading the environmental conditions that would affect her bullets during their long flight to the target. "This is where the amateurs get weeded out," Derek Stevens announced, loud enough for Margaret to hear. 1,200 yards isn't a game. You need serious equipment and serious skills to make hits at this distance. Margaret continued her preparation without acknowledging the comment. She was studying the wind flags positioned at intervals between the firing line and the targets, noting the patterns and variations that would affect bullet flight over the extended range. Her notebook contained detailed information about bullet drop, wind deflection, and atmospheric effects that she'd accumulated over decades of long-range shooting. 5 shots, 45 minutes, announced Mike Patterson. "This is precision shooting at its finest. Take your time, read the conditions, and make every shot count. When ready, the line is hot." The first shots from the most confident competitors began almost immediately. Jake Morrison, determined to prove his superiority, fired within 3 minutes of the line going hot. Through his spotting scope, he could see that his shot had missed the target entirely, the bullet impact visible in the dirt several feet to the left of the reactive target. "Wind got me," he muttered, making hasty adjustments to his scope and preparing for his second shot. Tommy Rodriguez took a more measured approach, spending 10 minutes studying the conditions before taking his first shot. His bullet struck the target frame but missed the scoring zone, earning him a 0 for the attempt. Margaret waited. She observed the other shooters' impacts, noting how the wind was affecting their bullets' flight paths. She watched the flags downrange, looking for patterns in the gusts that would allow her to time her shots for optimal conditions. Most importantly, she was settling into the mental state that extreme long-range shooting required, a state of focused calm that allowed her to execute perfect shots under pressure. 20 minutes into the stage, Margaret took her first shot at 1,200 yards. The rifle's report echoed across the range, and several seconds later, the distant reactive target moved, indicating a solid hit. The impact drew immediate attention from nearby competitors who'd been struggling with their own shots. "She hit," Lisa Chung announced, her voice carrying disbelief. "First shot at 1,200 yards, and she hit." Jake Morrison, who'd now missed 3 consecutive shots, watched through his spotting scope as Margaret prepared for her second attempt. "Lucky shot," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Margaret's second shot followed the first into the target, and her third completed what was clearly a pattern of consistent accuracy at extreme range. By the time she fired her fourth shot, a crowd of competitors had gathered behind her position to watch the demonstration of precision shooting that was unfolding. "This is impossible," Tommy Rodriguez said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Nobody shoots that consistently at 1,200 yards. Not with that equipment, not in these conditions." But Margaret was doing exactly that. Her fifth and final shot struck the target with the same precision as the previous 4, completing a perfect score that left the assembled competitors stunned into silence. Mike Patterson lowered his binoculars and stared at Margaret with undisguised amazement. In 30 years of range safety work, he'd never seen shooting like this from anyone other than the most elite military snipers, and even they rarely performed this consistently under pressure. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying deep respect. "That was extraordinary shooting. I've seen a lot of marksmen over the years, but that performance was in a class by itself." Margaret accepted the compliment with quiet grace, beginning to pack her equipment while other competitors continued their struggles with the challenging conditions. Several shooters had failed to hit the target even once, and those who'd managed hits had achieved far lower scores than her perfect performance. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" Lisa Chung asked, her competitive frustration replaced by genuine curiosity. "That wasn't luck, and it wasn't beginner's shooting. That was professional-level marksmanship." Margaret paused in her equipment packing, considering how much to reveal about her background. The competition was essentially over. Her combined scores from all 3 stages had put her in first place by a significant margin, and only a catastrophic failure by her combined with perfect shooting by everyone else could change the outcome. "I had excellent training," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "Sometimes experience matters more than equipment." The comment sparked a flurry of speculation among the assembled competitors. Military training was the obvious explanation. But Margaret's age suggested service during an era when women had been excluded from the kind of combat roles that produced elite marksmanship skills. What branch? Jake Morrison asked directly. When did you serve? Margaret's answer would have to wait. Brad Kelly's voice carried across the range, announcing that the formal competition had concluded and that final scores were being calculated. The presentation ceremony would follow, along with the revelation of Margaret Chen's true background that would reshape everything these young shooters thought they knew about precision marksmanship. As competitors began gathering their equipment and moving toward the award ceremony area, Margaret reflected on the day's events. She'd proven something to herself that had been decades in the making, but more importantly, she'd honored the memory of the instructor who'd taught her that precision shooting was as much about mental discipline as physical skill. The questions about her background would be answered soon enough, but for now, Margaret was content to have demonstrated that excellence had no expiration date. The award ceremony took place in the main tent as the Colorado afternoon sun began its descent behind the Rocky Mountains. Competitors gathered in loose clusters, their expensive gear and tactical clothing a stark contrast to Margaret Chen's simple attire as she sat quietly in the back, seemingly unaware that she'd just achieved something unprecedented in the competitions. 15-year history. Brad Kelly stepped to the makeshift podium with score sheets in hand, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Ladies and gentlemen, before we announce the winners, I need to verify some results that are, well, frankly extraordinary. He paused, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Margaret. Mrs. Chen, could you join me up here for a moment? Margaret rose from her chair, ignoring the whispered comments and speculative glances as she made her way to the front of the tent. The crowd parted slightly, creating a path that felt more like a gauntlet of skeptical stares than a gesture of respect. Mrs. Chen, Kelly began, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying to solve a puzzle. Your scores today are exceptional. Perfect at 400 yards, near perfect at 600, and a clean sweep at 1200 yards. In 15 years of running this competition, I've never seen performance like this. Jake Morrison stood up abruptly, his face flushed with frustration and embarrassment. There's got to be an explanation. Nobody shoots like that with equipment from the Stone Age. I want to see her rifle inspected again. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd of younger competitors, their wounded pride seeking any explanation that didn't involve admitting they'd been outshot by a woman old enough to be their grandmother. Mike Patterson, the range safety officer, stepped forward. With Margaret's rifle in hand. I've already conducted a post-competition inspection, he announced. Everything is completely legal and within specifications. The rifle, ammunition, and equipment all conform to competition rules. Then how do you explain it? Tommy Rodriguez demanded, his voice rising. She shows up looking like someone's grandmother and proceeds to outshoot trained snipers and federal agents. It doesn't make sense. Margaret had remained silent during the exchange, but now she stepped closer to the microphone. Her voice, when she spoke, carried a quiet authority that immediately commanded attention. It makes perfect sense, she said simply. If you know the whole story. She paused, her gaze moving across the assembled competitors, noting the skepticism, frustration, and curiosity in their faces. For 37 years, she'd kept her military service private, sharing details only with those who had a need to know. But standing here, having proven herself against some of the nation's finest marksmen, she decided it was time to honor the memory of those who'd trained her and the mission that had shaped her life. My name is Margaret Chen, she began, her voice steady and clear. Staff Sergeant Chen, retired, United States Army Special Operations. I served for 22 years, including multiple deployments as a precision marksman with classified units that officially didn't exist. The tent fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. In 1985, when Margaret had first entered military service, women were barred from direct combat roles. But she'd served during a transitional period when certain special operations units had begun quietly integrating female operators for missions that required their specific skills and abilities. From 1983 to 1985, I was part of an experimental program that placed female snipers in reconnaissance and counter-sniper roles, Margaret continued. We operated in Central America, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia, providing overwatch for special operations teams and conducting precision elimination of high-value targets. Jake Morrison's face had gone pale as he processed what Margaret was telling them. "You're talking about Project Athena," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I heard rumors about that program in sniper school, but everyone said it was classified legend." Margaret nodded slightly. "Not legend. Highly classified, but very real. 12 women completed the program. We were selected for psychological stability, physical capabilities, and most importantly, our ability to remain invisible in environments where male operators would be detected." She paused, her mind drifting back to memories that she'd kept buried for decades. Jungle operations in Honduras where she'd provided overwatch for teams infiltrating cartel compounds. Desert missions in Libya where her precision fire had enabled hostage rescues that never made the news. Urban environments in Beirut where she'd eliminated terrorist leaders from distances that seemed impossible to those who didn't understand the science of extreme long-range shooting. The program was disbanded. In 1985, when Congress passed legislation formally barring women from combat roles, Margaret continued. "Most of us were transferred to training positions or administrative roles. I spent the remainder of my career as a marksmanship instructor at Fort Benning, teaching advanced sniper techniques to special operations personnel." Lisa Chong, who'd been listening with growing amazement, spoke up from the crowd. "How many confirmed kills?" she asked, her voice respectful but curious. Margaret's expression grew distant for a moment. "That information remains classified," she replied. "But I can tell you that every shot was taken in defense of American personnel or in pursuit of objectives vital to national security." Tommy Rodriguez, who'd been one of the most vocal skeptics, slowly stood up. As a former Army Ranger, he'd heard whispers about female operators who'd served in roles that officially didn't exist. The idea had seemed like military folklore, stories told to impress civilians or embellish the mystique of special operations. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying newfound respect, "I need to apologize for my behavior today. If I'd known." Margaret held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "You couldn't have known. That was the point. We were trained to be invisible, to blend into environments where our presence would never be suspected. Today was no different." She gestured toward her simple clothing and modest equipment. "The best camouflage isn't military gear or tactical equipment. Sometimes it's looking exactly like what people expect to see, a retired grandmother with an old rifle and no apparent credentials." Brad Kelly, who'd been struggling to process the revelation, found his voice. "Mrs. Chen. Staff Sergeant Chen, this explains everything. Your shooting today wasn't exceptional for a civilian competitor. It was routine for someone with your background." Margaret smiled for the first time that day, an expression that transformed her face and revealed glimpses of the young soldier she'd once been. "Not routine," she corrected. "Today was special. This competition gave me a chance to honor the memory of my instructor, Master Sergeant James Morrison, who taught me that precision shooting is a discipline that improves with age and experience, not one that diminishes." Jake Morrison's head snapped up at the mention of the name. "James Morrison was my grandfather," he said, his voice filled with sudden understanding. "He died when I was 12, but I remember his stories about training female snipers for classified missions. He always said they were the finest marksmen he'd ever worked with." The connection hit Margaret like an emotional thunderbolt. She stared at Jake, seeing features that reminded her of the gruff master sergeant who'd pushed her to excellence during the most challenging period of her military career. "Your grandfather saved my life," she said quietly. "In Honduras, 1984. I was pinned down by counter-sniper fire, and he provided covering fire that allowed me to eliminate the threat and extract safely. He was the finest instructor I ever had, and the best soldier I ever served with." Jake's eyes filled with tears as he processed the connection between this woman and his beloved grandfather. "He talked about a female sniper named Chen," he said. "He said you were the most naturally gifted marksman he'd ever trained, that you could make shots other snipers considered impossible." Margaret reached into her equipment bag and pulled out a small wooden box that she'd carried to every shooting competition for the past 20 years. Inside, wrapped in a piece of faded camouflage cloth, was a military medallion, the unit coin from her classified special operations team. He gave this to me after my final mission, she said, handing the medallion to Jake. He said precision shooting was a sacred trust, that every shot taken in defense of others was a responsibility that never ended, even after military service. Jake examined the medallion with reverence, recognizing his grandfather's unit insignia alongside symbols that represented operations he'd never heard of. "Why are you showing me this?" he asked. "Because today wasn't about winning a competition," Margaret replied. "It was about proving to myself that the skills your grandfather taught me haven't diminished with age. It was about honoring his memory. By demonstrating that precision, patience, and preparation are more important than youth or expensive equipment." She paused, looking around at the assembled competitors who were hanging on every word. "And it was about reminding a new generation of marksmen that excellence comes from dedication and practice, not from assumptions about who belongs on the firing line." The tent had grown completely silent as the emotional weight of Margaret's revelation settled over the crowd. Derek Stevens, who'd been one of the most vocal skeptics, stepped forward with obvious embarrassment. "Ma'am, I owe you a profound apology," he said. "My comments today were inappropriate and based on ignorant assumptions. Your service to our country deserves respect, and your shooting today was a masterclass in precision marksmanship." One by one, other competitors began offering their own apologies and expressions of respect. The mockery and skepticism of the morning had been replaced by genuine admiration for Margaret's accomplishments. Both military and civilian, Mike Patterson approached Margaret with the competition's first-place trophy, a crystal award that seemed insignificant compared to the commendations she'd earned during her military career. "Staff Sergeant Chen," he said, using her military rank with obvious respect, "it's my honor to present you with this year's championship trophy. Your performance today was extraordinary by any standard." Margaret accepted the trophy graciously, but her attention was focused on Jake Morrison, who was still examining his grandfather's medallion with tears in his eyes. "Keep that," she told him. "Your grandfather would want you to have it. And remember what he taught me, that precision shooting is about more than hitting targets. It's about the discipline to prepare perfectly, the patience to wait for the right conditions, and the mental strength to perform when everything depends on a single shot." Jake nodded, understanding the profound gift he'd been given. "Will you teach me?" he asked. "The real techniques, not just the basic sniper training?" Margaret smiled, recognizing the same hunger for excellence that had driven her throughout her military career. "Come to Phoenix," she said. "We'll start with the fundamentals your grandfather taught me. But be prepared to work harder than you've ever worked in your life." As the crowd began to disperse, competitors approached Margaret individually to express their respect and ask questions about her experiences. The woman who'd been dismissed as a confused grandmother that morning was now recognized as one of the most accomplished marksmen any of them had ever encountered. Tommy Rodriguez waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching Margaret. "Ma'am," he said, his voice humble. "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a ranger. I thought I understood what combat shooting was about. Today taught me that I still have a lot to learn." Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, recognizing the sincerity in his voice. "Combat shooting and competition shooting are different disciplines," she replied. "But the fundamentals are the same: preparation, practice, and the mental discipline to perform under pressure. You have good skills. You just need to trust them more and let your ego interfere less." As the sun set behind the Colorado mountains, Margaret packed her equipment for the drive back to Phoenix. The trophy would join the other awards in her bedroom closet, but the real value of the day had been the opportunity to honor her instructor's memory and prove that excellence had no expiration date. Brad Kelly approached as she was loading her rifle case into her Honda Civic. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "would you consider returning next year as a guest instructor? I think our competitors could learn a lot from your experience and perspective." Margaret considered the offer as she closed her trunk. "I'll think about it," she replied. "But if I do come back, it won't be to compete. It'll be to teach the next generation that precision shooting is about more than equipment and ego." As she drove away from the Rocky Mountain Precision Shooting Championship, Margaret reflected on the day's events. She'd proven something to herself that had been decades in the making, that the skills Master Sergeant Morrison had taught her remained sharp, that her dedication to excellence hadn't diminished with age, but more importantly, she'd honored The memory of a fallen comrade and perhaps inspired a new generation of marksmen to understand that true precision came from within, not from the latest technology or tactical gear. In her rearview mirror, she could see the mountains where she'd demonstrated that sometimes the quietest people carry the most powerful capabilities. Tomorrow, she would return to her retirement routine in Phoenix, but she would carry with her the satisfaction of having proven that experience, preparation, and dedication could triumph over youth and arrogance, the young competitors she'd outshot. That day would remember the lesson for the rest of their careers: never underestimate the quiet ones, because they might just be carrying capabilities you never imagined possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.